Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll continue now where we left off yesterday in the book The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. We were talking about France rebelling against the temporal power of the Pope. We were talking about Pope Leo XII, who condemned Protestantism, condemned popular forms of government, condemned freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, as did all of his predecessors, and France continued to rebel against the temporal power of the Pope. And it's Pope Leo XII particularly leveled damnations and anathemas against Bible societies, those who printed the Bibles and distributed them in the vernacular, in other words, in the language of the people. The papacy hates the Bible. The papacy hates those who read the Bible, because those who read the Bible tend to reject the papacy. They see it as a human institution, not a divine institution. And they tend towards liberty, to reject the oppression and slavery of the papacy, the bondage to Rome, and seek liberty in Christ. This could ultimately lead to the absolute destruction of the papacy. If the whole world declared their liberty from the papacy would have no one to govern. So the papacy, as we've seen, got together with the monarchs of Europe and created a holy alliance, and with the assistance of the Jesuits tried to reimpose papal tyranny on the people. And so long after the Protestant Reformation, all of Europe realized that these Protestant nations were prospering, that they had advantages far in excess of anything that the Roman Catholic world had ever seen. And so they, too, following the example of the Protestants, wished to have their own constitution, to preserve their own rights, to separate church and state, to allow the Pope to be their spiritual leader, but not their temporal leader. Now, this leads me to the conclusion that the only reason the Roman Catholic nations of the world have to continually struggle against the temporal power of the Pope is because they still recognize his spiritual head. They still recognize his spiritual authority in the church. They still recognize the Roman Catholic Church as a Christian church. This is not so in a Protestant nation. They do not recognize the papacy as having any Christian authority whatsoever. And that's why they successfully threw off the monarchical system and found liberty in Christ, and then improved their status in the world. But these struggling Roman Catholic countries, for instance France, still recognizing the bogus spiritual authority of the Pope, continue to struggle against the Pope's temporal power as well. Now, continuing where we left off yesterday on page 273, about the middle of the page, the first full paragraph, it says, Charles X succeeded Louis XVIII as King of France, and the Jesuits, encouraged by the policy of Pope Leo XII, renewed their efforts in that country. Remember, the Jesuits had been kicked out of France. They were hated in France. But they took advantage of Pope Leo, the aggressive Pope who wished to reestablish monarchical rule or papal rule over the French, had the assistance of these Jesuits. And so, taking advantage of Leo's monarchical stroke in France, the Jesuits had an open door. Now, he says they desired to get control of the young. The Jesuits always wish to get control of the young. They seek to be the educators of children. He says they desired to get control of the young, as they have always done, and therefore demanded that all public instruction in colleges and schools be confided to them. the Jesuits. If assent to this demand had depended upon the king alone, it would doubtless have been obtained, because it was an essential part of the policy which brought about the alliance of the Bourbon and other sovereigns with the papacy. So even these monarchs recognized the importance of having the Jesuits in control of education, so that they are brought up in support of the monarchical or papal power. But the people of France knew the Jesuits too well to entrust their children to the Jesuits' care, and were so united in resisting this demand that Charles X was compelled to refuse their request. Okay? Popular uprising against the Jesuits. No way are we going to allow the Jesuits to educate our children. We're sick up to here with Jesuit intrigue in our country. They have no right to teach our children. They want to uphold the monarchical, papal, temporal power of the Pope, and they teach our children to be compatible with that system, and we want liberty. No way in Hades are we going to allow the Jesuits to teach our children. That was the attitude of the French. Roman Catholic France, that was the attitude of Roman Catholic France. Would to God that there was that kind of resistance to the Jesuits and their control of education in this country, preparing our children to be a citizen in a global government, under a global religion, a global ecumenical religion, where we mix the gospel of Jesus Christ with every other cult on the planet. Ecumenism means mixing the holy with the profane. It means making the Pope the temporal and spiritual ruler of the planet. That's what our children are being indoctrinated with in our public schools. Now, some people are wise enough to bring their children out of the public schools and educate them in their homes. God bless their efforts. But just remember, it's Jesuit curriculum that they are forced by law to impose upon their own children. They've just taken the indoctrination out of the hands of the public school and put it upon themselves. There needs to be a complete revamp of the education system in this country. The Jesuits need to get their hands out of education. They need to get the Jesuits out of our churches and out of our schools. For the survival of this nation, for liberty to continue in this country, or to be restored in this country, rather, the Jesuits must be evicted out of this country like they were evicted out of every Roman Catholic country in the planet. If we fail to acknowledge this horde of Jesuits who control information, control speech, control the press, control education, control the seminaries, this country's doomed. Liberty is doomed. Protestantism is doomed. It is the target of the Jesuits to destroy Protestantism from wherever it exists. And no greater place in the world does Protestantism exist than in the United States of America. They've nearly got it defeated. Well, let us take an example from France. Roman Catholic France. He said, but the people of France knew the Jesuits too well to entrust their children to their care, and were so united in resisting this demand that Charles X was compelled to refuse their request. Imagine if that statement would read this. But the people of the United States knew the Jesuits too well to entrust their children to their care, and were so united in resisting this demand of the Jesuits that the United States government was compelled to refuse their request and to evict every Jesuit from our shores. Would to God that someday there was a book written with that sentence in it. It says, and in order to rebuke the Jesuits as signally as possible, the public authorities provided by law that no one should be employed to teach who belonged to any religious congregation, a fact which shows how far they felt justified in going in order to escape what they deemed a serious evil. Okay, now don't be mistaken that France was turning toward irreligion. They wanted the schools to be secular in order to separate church and state. The proper sphere for a religious education, in my view, and in the view of these French, and in the view of the United States during its founding, was that the best place for spiritual education was in the church and in the home. The schools should teach secular education. And only because if it changes that rule, Roman Catholicism always gains the ascendancy. If we could guarantee that Protestantism, the tenets of Protestantism, the liberty of Christ, the gospel of Jesus Christ will be preached and taught in the schools, then I would support it wholly, with the Bible on the desk of every student. But that's not what happens. Roman Catholics always put up an offense that is never matched by Protestant defense. And Rome always gains the upper hand. France wanted the schools to be secular. Nobody of any religious sect should be teaching in the schools in France. And it says this provision, however, for an exclusively secular education was made in full accordance with the Gallican Catholics and the Protestant sentiment in France. In other words, the Protestants assented to this, and so did the Gallican Catholics, who loved their liberties. And it was intended not as tending in the least degree to irreligion, but it was a necessary step toward the complete separation of church and state. They wanted a system similar to the United States. Now, Leo XII died pending these agitations. And when his successor was elected, as near our own time as 1829, and took the name of Pope Pius VIII, the revolutionary embers needed only a little more stirring to break into an open flame. The success of constitutional government was becoming more and more apparent, and it was evident to the Allied sovereigns that unless the current beating against them could be set back, they were in danger of being overwhelmed. Okay, popular constitutional governments were becoming so successful that it put monarchism in even a darker light. People all of a sudden knew what it was to be free and to set their own laws and to establish their own liberties, to elect their own kings. They were prosperous. They were peaceful. They were successful. And as their benefits rose, as their condition of life improved, they looked back at the old monarchical, the old papal system, the old world order, and it grew darker and darker and darker by the day. The Pope was losing ground. And it says, as the idea of church and state united was involved in the entire papal and royal policy, those therefore who were struggling after constitutional guarantees of freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and of religious belief had no difficulty in understanding that these great natural rights were especially anathematized by the late Pope Leo XII for the reason that they constituted the fundamental principles upon which that form of government must rest. Okay? So in order to destroy popular governments, the papacy condemned freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. Knowing that they were the foundation, these constitutional governments could not continue. If freedom of the press and freedom of speech and religious liberty were suppressed. So he condemned them all. He wanted to restore all of Europe back to the monarchical, the papal system. Retrogression, this author calls it. Wants to restore them to the old world order. Now it says, consequently, the masses of the people, Roman Catholics and Protestants alike, became more and more united and clamorous for these rights, not only because they were in themselves of inestimable value, but because they had come to realize that the nations which maintained them were advancing in prosperity, happiness, and enlightenment far more rapidly than those which suppressed and denied them. Pope Pius VIII could not avoid realizing all of this, as well as the obligation resting upon the papacy as the spiritual patron and guardian of monarchism to arrest the popular tendency toward constitutional government. Accordingly, he had scarcely entered upon his pontificate when, wedded to the policy of retrogression, like his immediate predecessors, Pope Pius VII and Leo XII, he endeavored to engraft the teachings of the Jesuits more firmly than ever upon the doctrines of the Church. Every time the Roman Catholic Church, the papacy, begins to lose prestige and power and influence in the governments of the world, they solicit the help of the Jesuits. Again, stop and think. There's no resistance in this country against the Jesuits, who are the spiritual leaders of the governors of this world, of this country. We have a Jesuit priest who's the chaplain of the Congress, the spiritual advisor of the legislative body of this country, that legislative body which represents the people. The people who want liberty, who want constitutional government, who use this legislative body, Congress, to uphold the rights of the people. We have a Jesuit priest as a spiritual advisor. Somebody kick me. It's insane. And it's allowed only because the American people know not what a Jesuit is. They don't have a clue about their history. They don't have a clue what they stand for. And that's why Inquisition Update is on First Amendment Radio, and that's why I'm reading this book, Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. Get a copy. Get two if you can find it. The Jesuits hate this book. It's hard to find unless somebody's now reprinting it. Accordingly, he had scarcely entered upon his pontificate when, wedded to the policy of retrogression, he was married to the policy of retrogression. This pope knew that if he gave up on the monarchical power, the papacy would fold like a cheap suit. He says his pontificate was wedded to the policy of retrogression like his immediate predecessors, Pius VII and Leo XII. He endeavored to engraft the teachings of the Jesuits more firmly than ever upon the doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church. He addressed a circular letter to the bishops of Christendom, which, being the whole church and concerning the faith, was necessarily ex cathedra, in other words, from the throne. This is an infallible document, this circular that he sent out to the bishops. It says, wherein he pointed out some of the existing errors they were commanded to extirpate, to annihilate. Okay? This, according to the Jesuit teaching, was an act of infallibility and required implicit obedience from all who were faithful to the papacy. Like everybody in Congress that is faithful to the papacy would have been spiritually bound to read this circular and to do what it said. Okay? I want to ask the question to my listeners. Should there be any Roman Catholics in government? When the Pope, at any whim, decides to write an advisory circular instead of a papal bull or an encyclical and send it out to all the bishops in the country, and there's a whole bunch of them in this country, and that everybody that has a spiritual affinity for the papacy and the Roman Catholic Church must, on pain of excommunication and eternal damnation, apply whatever principles that the Pope writes in this circular letter. Again, I ask the question, should there be any Roman Catholics in government in this country? He says, this, according to the Jesuit teaching, was an act of infallibility and required implicit obedience from all who were faithful to the papacy. It would have been well suited to the Middle Ages. After condemning secret societies, overlooking, of course, the Jesuits, the greatest secret society on the planet, and the quote-unquote fierce Republicans, in other words, those who wanted republics and constitutions, or supporters of popular government as the enemies of God and kings, he arraigned them for, quote, breaking the bridle of the true faith, in other words, breaking the bridle of the church and passive obedience to princes, and thus opening the way up to all crimes. They had broken the bridle that the church had placed on their heads, and they had broken their passive obedience to princes. They were no longer passively obedient to the monarchical system. And these people he openly condemned as the way to all crimes. Okay? The papacy hates liberty. The papacy hates freedom. The papacy hates the gospel of Jesus Christ. It hates Protestantism. It hates freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience. It hates the fact that you have the right to carry a gun to protect those liberties that you so enjoy. The Pope insisted that they were endeavoring to, quote, hurl religion and empires into an abyss. In other words, to hurl the Pope and his kings into an abyss. Guess what? That's exactly what Christ is going to do when he returns. But the Pope doesn't like that. He doesn't like us doing it prematurely. Okay? He says he insisted that they were endeavoring to hurl religion, that is the Roman Catholic Church, and empires, that is the monarchs of the Roman Catholic Church, the governing authority of the Church, the Pope and his kings, into an abyss. Unquote. And when he reached the culminating point, he expressed himself in these words, quote, we must, venerable brethren, pursue these dangerous sophists. We must denounce their works to the tribunals. We must hand over their persons to the inquisitors and recall them by tortures to the sentiments of the true faith of the spouse of Christ. Unquote. That's an open declaration of war and torture to preserve the papal and monarchical power in the world. That's the Pope. And he has advocates in the government in the United States today. We'll be back right after this.
Years ahead of the dominant media, FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet. or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
In this day of economic uncertainty and soaring unemployment, safe investments are often hard to find. But investing in the precious metals is the safest investment of all, because gold and silver is real money. Government-printed currency is not. Call Melody Cedarstrom at Discount Gold and Silver Trading Company at 1-800-375-4188. Melody has been helping people secure their financial future for over 10 years. While others in the business claim honesty, Melody will deliver. Give her a call, 1-800-375-4188. That's 800-375-4188.
Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. If you value the information you get here, please support FirstAmendmentRadio.com, who supports the program. Now, we'll continue. Remember, this Pope Pius VIII, this Roman Catholic Pope, is speaking about Roman Catholics in Roman Catholic nations. Roman Catholics who want to throw off the temporal power of the Pope and all his monarchs. They want to establish their own governments. They want to assure their own freedoms. They want to limit the power of government to its rightful area. They want to separate church and state. They want to be like America, basically, only they want to remain Roman Catholic. Remember, don't forget, this is a Roman Catholic country and Roman Catholic people, and this Pope said, quote, "We must, venerable brethren, pursue these dangerous sophists. We must denounce their works to the tribunals, to the ecclesiastical courts that are overseen by Roman Catholic priests. We must hand over their persons to the inquisitors." In other words, they deliver them up to the Inquisition to be tortured until they recant their rebellion against the divine right rule of the Pope. He says, and we must recall them by tortures to the sentiments of the true faith of the spouse of Christ. That's right. The papacy regards the Roman Catholic Church and the Roman Catholic Church alone to be the spouse of Christ. And I just can't help reiterating one more time, this is the papacy talking to Roman Catholics who want liberty, who want to acknowledge the Pope's spiritual power, but want none of his temporal power. They want to separate church and state. And this Pope wants to throw these Catholics into the Inquisition and torture them and bring them back to the true faith of the Roman Catholic Church, the spouse of Christ. Now think what anathemas and damnations the papacy would hurl at this Protestant nation, who calls the papacy the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist, that won't accept his spiritual or his temporal power, that believe he is the vicar of Satan himself, the dynasty through which Lucifer tries to exalt his throne above that of God himself. Is that not what the papacy is? I mean, the Bible paints such a clear picture about who this is that it cannot be missed, and yet it's never talked about in the churches today. Imagine the hatred that the papacy must have toward the United States of America. The papacy regards the Catholics in this country just as liberal, just as revolutionary, just as rebellious, or even more so than those of France. They've lived under a Protestant constitution that guarantees that the church can never unite with the state, and that Roman Catholics have rights, that the papacy damns. They've lived in this country under a Protestant government for as long as this country has existed. How do you suppose the Vatican views Roman Catholics in this country? And yet the United States, this country that is so hated by the papacy, its liberal tendencies so hated by the papacy, has become the papal proxy warrior of the Pope and goes around the world conquering other nations to bring them into a global government headed up by the Pope. I mean, it's a state of affairs that cannot be comprehended in just normal English language. It is an unbelievable state of affairs that this country, once called Protestant, could become the warrior for the Pope, that could join ecumenically with the Roman Catholic Church after being flattered by this fork-tongued papacy at Vatican Council II. Are you kidding me? I mean, the Protestant reformers must be turning in their graves. If they were still alive and could comprehend what is happening, and no, they're not looking down upon us from heaven. They're in their graves awaiting the resurrection. They have no part in anything to do under the sun anymore. Okay? But if they could see what is happening in this country, they would all turn in their graves. And I've said it even this way. No, they wouldn't turn in their graves. They'd come out of their graves and they'd stone us all. The insanity that is taking place in this country cannot be expressed in normal human language. This is the greatest apostasy. This is the greatest refutation of Christ that could be comprehended, of a people that once valued Christ and the Bible and the liberty and denounced the papacy as Antichrist. What has become of us? We're so timid we can't even utter what the Protestant reformers used to scream from the rooftops at the risk of their own lives. It's just, well, I'm not going to wax emotional. These are the facts. These are the facts, and we have to weigh the facts and make some solid conclusions and then act on those conclusions. That's what I'm saying. Okay? No more hand-wringing. We got to speak out. And we have to speak with authority, without equivocation, without compromise, without double talk, in clear, plain English that even an idiot can understand, because this country's full of them. And most of them occupy places behind the pulpits in our churches. We have to take back the heritage that Christ died to give us. Nobody's going to just hand it to us. We have to take it back. He says these denunciations and threatenings were intended for those Roman Catholic populations who had always venerated the Roman Catholic Church in order to turn them away from their revolutionary course. It bears repeating, these are Roman Catholics who have come to their senses. Oh yes, they still believe the Roman Catholic Church is a Christian church and the Pope is the vicar of Christ, but at least they're ready to throw off the temporal power of the Pope. Can't say that for the Americans today. He says, but their increasing enlightenment enabled them to understand that they were papal interpolations upon the primitive faith. In other words, it didn't previously exist in the Roman Catholic Church. This is new. This Pope exerting his kingly power, it was not so in the beginning. The Pope was just a bishop among bishops. He had no temporal power. He says, not being disposed to make open war upon the Pope, whose sacred office they revered, erroneously, I'll add, they attributed them to the undue influence of the Jesuits over him. Okay? They didn't want to offend their blessed Holy Father in Rome. They were blaming all this on the Jesuits. Well, certainly the Jesuits were to blame, but there's no exonerating the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist who solicits the Jesuits to help prop up his phony throne. Now, this was especially the case in France, where during the pontificate of Pope Pius VIII, as we have seen, the efforts to bring the government in subjection to the papacy were attributed to Jesuit intrigue. Let me read it again. The intrigue of the Jesuits at this time was to bring the government into subjection to the papacy. That's what the Jesuits do. They bring all governments into subjection to the papacy. And when you see the United States of America waging war against another nation, it's to bring that government into subjection to the papacy. This Protestant nation is bringing all the nations of the world into subjection to the papacy, the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. You see how great the apostasy is in this country? We Jesuits walking freely throughout this country. They've established 10 provincials in this country. A shadow government that's not hidden. It's hidden in plain sight. 10 provinces, 10 Jesuit provinces. that cover the entire continental United States of America. They operate freely. And their purpose is to bring our government into subjection to the papacy. And to bring it so much into subjection to the papacy that the papacy can use its military, its economic might, its people, its gold, its resources, everything to help bring the rest of the nations into subjection to the papacy. I'm being redundant, but it's necessary, isn't it? He says this gave the general sentiment throughout France a tendency toward liberalism, as was indicated not only by frequent popular demonstrations during the reign of Charles X, but especially at the period here referred to by an election of the Chamber of Deputies. In July of 1830, an overwhelming majority of liberal members were elected to the chamber, which alarmed the monarchical and royal power and increased the activity of the Jesuits. Okay? Anytime you put a liberal, and then in this case, don't forget, we're not talking about Democrats here. Liberal in the context of the papacy literally means those who have departed from the teaching of the magisterium of the Roman Catholic Church and decide to write their own laws. Liberals are those who reject the authority of the papacy and try to organize their own governments. Okay? So they put these liberals on this chamber, and that obviously alarmed these monarchs, these papal monarchs, and it drove the Jesuits into fervent activity. That's what the Jesuits do. They come right to the battle anytime a power raises its head that is contrary to the papacy. Now, to counteract the influence of this election, an effort was made to turn the popular attention away from it by exciting the national pride in favor of royalty in consequence of the successful termination of the war with Algiers. So the Jesuits want to take away people's attention from this. It's a diversion. Okay? We see this all the time in the mainstream media. Whenever the American people start focusing on anything that will truly educate them about what really our government is doing, they can throw up any kind of a distraction. And the press cooperates with this. You know, we're talking about the United States engaged in clandestine military operations through the CIA in a foreign land, and all of a sudden, Britney Spears or something gets out of a car with no undies on, and the cameras are all taking pictures, and we get to see Britney Spears going commando on the television. We don't hear any more about what the CIA and the government, the Catholics in action at the CIA, are doing overseas in a foreign land. They control the press. Remember, the Pope condemns freedom of the press. He wants control of the press. And he's got control of the press in this country. That the mainstream media can all of a sudden shift gears from exposing corruption in our government, foreign military operations, clandestine, against the will of the people of this country, and all of a sudden we're all looking at Britney Spears with no undies on. The Jesuits are brilliant at this. They've got centuries of practice at it. Distraction and diversion. To counteract the influence of this election, an effort was made to turn the popular attention away from it by exciting the national pride in favor of royalty in consequence of the successful termination of the war at Algiers. The royalists made this the cause of great rejoicing, and when they supposed that the people, impelled by their ideas of national glory, had become sufficiently enthusiastic, resolved upon a step designed to crush out the popular spirit of liberalism. That's what they were doing behind the scenes. While everybody was waving the French flag and rejoicing of their successful completion of the war in Algiers, the Jesuits were putting down these liberals. The press covered the jubilation in the streets while the Jesuits were putting down this papal rebellion in this council, in this chamber. See how it works? History repeats itself every day in the United States of America. Only, if the American people are coming wise to the fact that the press serves more as a distraction from what really matters, but they have no idea who is benefiting from this. This book tells us who is benefiting. In every case, the benefit is secretly achieved underneath all the fanfare on the television. The benefit is achieved for the papacy and the Jesuits restoring this country to monarchical rule, to papal rule, in support of Vatican Council II and the ecumenical movement. Because all the Protestants are ashamed now to be Protestants. They repudiate the Protestant Reformation. They repudiate the idea that the papacy is the Antichrist. They believe Antichrist now is future, way off at the last 7 years before Christ returns. The papacy is exonerated. Automatically, you must believe that the Protestant Reformation was a grievous assault against the vicar, the replacement of the Son of God on earth, and we must repent, and we must make reparations to the Vatican by fighting papal proxy wars. Am I getting through to anybody? Can I hear an amen? Just one? You see how it works? You see how this system works? We have freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, so we can resist the papacy and monarchical government. And we can hold Christ high. We can hold the gospel of Jesus Christ high on the hills. And we can have that liberty wherewith He has made us free. We can champion Christ if we'll stand up and do it. But if we kowtow to these papists, these monarchists, these Jesuits who control our government, we are enslaved more deeply than the Israelites in Egyptian slavery. You afraid to be called an anti-Roman Catholic bigot? Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. And if Christ be for me, who can be against me? I'm going to exercise my freedom of speech. I'm going to hold up the gospel. I'm going to hold up Jesus Christ. And I'm going to condemn his counterfeit in this world, the papacy. I'm going to uphold the biblical truth that Christ and Christ alone is our King. And the Pope is a usurpation of that rightful throne. And Satan is the power behind that papacy. I want to restore Protestantism in this country. I want to restore the truth to anybody who will listen and remind us that if we're not willing to fight for that liberty, the Pope will be glad to take it away from us. And instead of answering to Christ, he will use the civil law to make us answer to him, even with the most sophisticated military and in law enforcement technology that they can produce. You see, the papacy didn't hesitate to stretch French Roman Catholics on the rack, waterboard them, cut off their heads, torture them, torment them, interrogate them, starve them to death in the Inquisitions for their heresy of rejecting the papal temporal throne. What do you think he will do to Protestants in this country if he gets the power to do so? We have a real lethal enemy in this country, and he might be your neighbor. He might be a Roman Catholic who is loyal to his Pope first. And ready, willing, and able to defend the temporal power of the Pope and to cooperate with the government against God's holy people in this country, to help the government impose a holy Roman Inquisition in this country. Do we just sit and wring our hands about it? Or do we speak out about it? I want the Jesuits out of this country. I want every Roman Catholic out of any seat of authority in this country. Liberal though they may be, no Roman Catholic has any right to any office of government or law enforcement or a judgeship or any position of authority in this country until he renounces the papacy. If he wants to be an American, he can be an American. If he wants to be a papist, he can be a papist, but they never should dwell together in peace. I've been accused, Tom, you're trying to start a religious war. I remind you, that religious war began in heaven before the world ever was. And neither you nor me or a combination of people anywhere in the world is ever going to bring this religious war to an end. This is destined to happen. This is prophesied to happen. Christ versus Antichrist. The body of Christ versus the Roman Catholic counterfeit. We either take up the sword, the two-edged sword that cuts in both directions, or we lay down and just let them chop off our heads. And granted, my listeners could probably suppose by now I'm not willing to go down easy. So they elected liberals to this chamber, obviously in support of a popular form of government, a constitution, liberty, Roman Catholics wanting liberty, and the Jesuits going on the attack against these liberals in this chamber diverted the attention of the whole nation by raising up a patriotic fervor because of the successful termination of the war with Algiers. Diversion. The people who loved the entertainment would rather go to the parade over the victory, over the end of the war in Algiers, instead of preserving their hopeful liberties through the election of these liberals in the chamber. Did they really want liberty? Or did they want a party? That's what the United States is up to now. They'd rather party than maintain their liberty. You know, all the fun of partying goes right out the windows when you realize that you're an abject slave to the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist. I say we skip the parade and get on about the war. See you tomorrow on Inquisition Update.
Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter The Left Behind Paradigm of Future Events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.